The Sleeper Philosopher, the Existential Crisis, finding meaning in the quiet. Welcome to the Sleeper Philosopher. Tonight, as the day's pressure dissolves and the shadows grow long outside your window, we turn our attention inward. We seek stillness not to avoid the great questions of life, but to finally listen to them. Our subject tonight is the existential crisis. Perhaps you felt it, that quiet, unsettling impression, usually after the world has gone silent. When the sheer scale of the universe presses down, and you ask yourself those grand, terrifying questions. Why am I here? What is the point of all this relentless striving? These moments are not signs of weakness. They are the sound of a thinking mind encountering the vast, indifferent reality of the cosmos. It is, in its own way, a profound philosophical awakening, a demanding call for self-reflection. For the next while, let's explore this inner conflict not with panic, but with calm curiosity. We'll use the quiet of this moment to anchor ourselves, to understand the components of this crisis, and to softly illuminate the path back toward personal meaning. Lie back. Allow the distant rain to wash away the noise of the day, the stress of the week. Let the deep quiet of this space settle over you. Tonight, we don't fight the quiet questions. We listen to them. Chapter 1. Defining the inner conflict. Crisis of meaning and identity. The term existential crisis sounds dramatic, perhaps something reserved for the heightened reality of literature or the abstract theories of academia. It often conjures images of panicked, youthful confusion. But at its core, especially for those of us navigating the complex currents of middle age, it's simply an inner conflict, a profound psychological and spiritual collision that demands our attention. It is the intense, unsettling feeling that life lacks ultimate meaning coupled with a deep, paralyzing confusion about one's personal identity and value in a seemingly indifferent universe. This sensation is often inseparable from persistent feelings of anxiety and stress, often to a degree that it silently disturbs our normal functioning, that it interferes with the simple ability to experience genuine presence in the day. It may manifest as waking at 3 a.m. with a cold dread, or staring blankly at a successful career path and feeling utterly nothing. Think of it this way: we, as human beings, are fundamentally, desperately meaning-seeking creatures. Our brains are hardwired to construct narratives and assign value. We build our lives on a foundation of purpose, our careers, our families, our faith, our social roles. An existential crisis occurs when that foundation seems to crumble, when the scaffolding around our lives, built perhaps on outdated ambitions or inherited expectations, collapses, leaving us suspended over a perceived vacuum of meaning. The crisis is characterized by two defining, intertwining elements, demanding separate, quiet scrutiny. The crisis of meaning. The void. This is the feeling of meaninglessness. It is the central, cold observation that your usual activities, the daily grind of work, the meticulous projects, the accumulated achievements, suddenly appear arbitrary or pointless against the vast scale of time and space. The questions echo in the dark, stripped of any comforting rationale. Why wake up? Why strive for this promotion? Why bother with any of the societal rituals? It's the shift from acknowledging that some parts of life are meaningless to the paralyzing suspicion that everything might be. It's the realization that the universal script you tacitly believed in, the script promising reward for effort or purpose for existence, is not actually written. The crisis of identity, the unknowable self. This involves the ultimate, personal question: who am I truly? It's the profound disconnect between the role you play, parent, employee, partner, friend, and the isolated, essential self beneath the facade. When the crisis of meaning strips away the value of your external achievements, the crisis of identity is left naked. The core feeling is one of disorientation, a sense of being fundamentally lost to yourself. It is a necessary, though painful, confrontation with your truest self, the self that must exist outside of its job title or its relationship status. Crucially, unlike an outward, practical crisis, like a financial collapse or a social conflict, the existential crisis is strictly inner in nature. External events, losing a job, the death of a loved one, or a health scare, can certainly trigger it by shattering a pre-existing source of meaning. But the true battle happens entirely within your own mind, concerning your most core beliefs and desires. The resolution, therefore, is also internal. It demands that we address the internal conflict and painstakingly find or create new sources of meaning. Existentialism, the philosophical framework, this idea of an indifferent world confronted by a searching, desperate individual is, of course, the heart of existentialism, the philosophical movement that gives this experience its name. Figures like Soren Kierkegaard and Albert Camus wrestled with this reality, recognizing that the human need for meaning often crashes against a universe that offers no pre-written script. They spoke of related concepts. Existential dread, angst. This is the profound, non-specific anxiety that arises when the self is confronted by its own absolute freedom and the vast emptiness of existence. It is the dizziness of choice. The existential vacuum, as defined by Viktor Frankl, this is the psychological void left when the traditional, external sources of meaning are removed, leaving an inner emptiness that clamors to be filled. Alienation, the sense of being estranged from oneself, from others, and from the natural world, a direct consequence of the crisis of identity and meaning. The crisis forces a personal confrontation with the key aspects of the human condition, the givens that we spend our lives trying to ignore, our sheer existence. Why am I, rather than not? The terrifying reality of death, finitude, our radical freedom to choose our path, and the resulting responsibility for those choices. We are forced to question the very foundations we built our lives upon. The three components of the crisis, deconstructing the experience. Psychologists and psychotherapists often categorize the existential crisis into three manageable parts. Understanding these helps us deconstruct the feeling, making it less intimidating, less like an unsolvable riddle, and more like a set of distinct challenges we can address one by one. A. Emotional components. The feelings. These are the immediate, visceral, unpleasant sensations that bring you here tonight, revealing the internal pressure cooker, emotional pain, despair, helplessness, guilt, anxiety, or loneliness. Anxiety and fear, free-floating dread. This anxiety is often free-floating. It's not tied to a specific external danger, like a lion or a billiardoo, but to the reality of existence itself, our freedom and our limitations. The feeling is one of internal panic, or a deep state of mourning for something you cannot quite name or retrieve. This existential dread is the awareness that your existence is contingent. It didn't have to be. Despair and helplessness, the paralysis of choice. A feeling of being unable to find a viable path forward or an answer to the meaning question, leading to a loss of hope and motivation. The despair is caused by being unable to find meaning. The helplessness arises from the paralyzing sense of having no practical response to deal with that despair. This can often lead to apathy, a state where making any effort seems pointless. Guilt, existential guilt, the burden of potential. This is often not guilt over a specific wrongdoing, but a vague, unsettling sense that one has not lived up to their potential or the call of their true self. It is a debt owed to your own possibility. It can take the abstract form of a bad conscience or a generalized sense of personal responsibility for one's stagnant predicament. This guilt is often accompanied by a deep fear of death, especially in later life crises, where the feeling is that time is running out to fulfill the self. Loneliness and alienation, the unbridgeable gulf. A disturbed sense of personal integrity. The absence of meaning negatively impacts one's relationships with oneself, others, and the world. This lack of a clear purpose threatens one's sense of self and can lead to insecurity and self-abandonment. The loneliness here is existential isolation, the profound, quiet realization that even in the closest relationship, we face the universe alone, a feeling that no human can fully know or share our subjective reality. While these feelings are deeply unpleasant, they are also deeply informative. They carry a positive potential. For instance, the raw, uncomfortable experience of loneliness may push us toward a better understanding of the true substance and importance of authentic, close relationships, providing a painful but necessary direction for future growth. B. Cognitive components, the thoughts. These are the intellectual and abstract issues that fuel the emotional distress, often playing on loop in the restless mind. Meaninglessness, the central deficit. The central issue, the belief that there is no higher significance, direction, or purpose in our actions or in the world at large. It is associated with the persistent question of why one is doing what one is doing and why one should continue. In Viktor Frankl's Logotherapy, this is the existential vacuum, a void that needs to be filled with self-created purpose. The experience is often described as feeling hollow, empty, or directionless. Loss of personal values, the shattered idols. Things that once seemed fundamentally valuable, career success, status, possessions, or even a long-standing relationship, begin to appear insignificant or pointless. The goals that once motivated us now feel like meaningless rituals. This disillusionment is a necessary clearing of the ground. When the crisis is resolved, it often leads to the discovery of new, more authentic values that align with the true, unmasked self. Confrontation with death, the deadline of life. The cold realization of one's own finitude. While abstractly known, the crisis makes this fact personal and concrete. For many, this confrontation is associated with acute anxiety and a feeling of desperation. But the contemplation of one's limited time can also act as a powerful source of meaning. It is the ultimate deadline that makes the remaining time more valuable, forcing us to prioritize and making it easier to discern the bigger issues that matter from the smaller everyday distractions. C. Behavioral components. The actions. These are the outward, observable expressions of the internal turmoil, the ways the body and mind try to cope with the immense inner pressure. Isolation and withdrawal. Retreat from connection. Limiting social interaction, communicating less, and reducing non-essential contact, often resulting in the long-term deterioration of relationships. Communication may be limited to brief, necessary responses in order to avoid a more extended exchange, fearing that deeper vulnerability will only expose the inner vacuum. Addictive and compulsive behavior, the substitute for meaning. Turning to drugs, alcohol, excessive work, or even ritualistic behavior to lessen the impact of the negative internal experiences. These actions provide short-term relief, pleasure, distraction, but are profoundly maladaptive on the long-term level, failing to resolve the core conflict and often exacerbating the crisis. The person struggles to distinguish the need for pleasure and power from the fundamental need for meaning. Antisocial behavior, outward hostility. In some cases, hostility or aggression, sometimes directed at the person themselves, self-injury, or, in the worst case, culminating in profound depression, apathy, and even self-destructive ideation. The chronic, severe stress associated with the crisis can also lead to various chronic health problems, from high blood pressure to long-term systemic inflammation. Seeking therapy, the positive step. On the positive side, the tendency to seek therapy or engage in serious philosophical reflection reflects the person's awareness of the gravity of the problem and their sincere, enduring desire to resolve it. It is the first authentic act of choosing meaning over despair. When you recognize these patterns in yourself, when you feel that persistent, draining mix of fear, meaninglessness, and withdrawal, take a deep breath. Acknowledge that you are not simply unraveling. You are entering a state of reevaluation. This process, though painful and demanding, is an essential prerequisite for genuine growth and the creation of an authentic, self-chosen life. Chapter 2. The Crisis Across the Lifespan. A developmental journey world map. Existential crises are not bound to a single time in life. They are developmental. They shift and change, reflecting the specific questions and challenges of each life stage. Understanding which stage you're in helps clarify the source of your meaning struggle. The crises generally fall into two categories: forward-looking, earlier crises, characterized by potential, and backward-looking, later crises, characterized by mortality. A. The forward-looking crises, anxiety of potential. These are characterized by anxiety and confusion about the future, the path one should follow, and the self one should become. 1. The teenage crisis, identity and independence. This involves the transition from childhood dependency to adult independence, centering around the issue of developing one's individuality and independence. Issues: establishing a personal moral code, finding peers, distancing oneself from family standards. Rebellious behavior may be interpreted as an attempt to achieve independence. Conformity to a peer group is often a temporary step in this process. Resolution key: finding meaning and purpose in one's new identity. Independence without purpose leads to the feeling of being lost and can result in depression. 2. The quarter-life crisis, sophomore and adult, occurring roughly between 18 and 30. This is the time of immense pressure to commit to a life trajectory. It is often referred to as the sophomore slump when affecting students. The sophomore crisis, early 20s. This is the first time that serious questions about career, long-term relationships, and the meaning of life become direct, practical issues tied to one's future. The anxiety is over one's future potential and the vast, frightening options. This crisis often specifically affects high achievers who fear they will not reach their highest potential due to a lack of a secure plan. The adult crisis, mid to late 20s. This deepens the sophomore phase, incorporating complex identity issues like political outlook, spirituality, and sexuality. Resolving it means having a good idea of who one is as a person and being comfortable with this idea. Reaching full adulthood, often associated with completing school and achieving financial independence. Resolution key: making practical, meaningful commitments that align with introspective self-knowledge, rather than just societal expectations. Committing too early without sufficient exploration, known as identity foreclosure, can set up a more severe crisis later on. B. The backward-looking crises, regret and mortality. These crises are often triggered by the impression that one is past their peak. They involve assessing past choices and confronting finitude. 3. The midlife crisis, regret and reassessment. Often setting in around age 40. This is the most widely discussed crisis. It's triggered by the impression that personal growth is obstructed or that one's aspirations are significantly distant from one's achievements. Issues: intense questioning of past choices, career, partner, missed opportunities. A backward-looking component assesses previous choices, leading to regrets and dissatisfaction. This is often connected to the impression that one is past one's peak period in life. Triggers: specific events like job loss, extramarital affairs, separation, death of a loved one, or health problems. It affects women just as well as men, with additional factors including the onset of menopause or the end of the reproductive period. Resolution key: not fighting the reality of age, but entering a period of transition and reevaluation, adapting to a changed situation and focusing on the meaning that remains. 4. The later life crisis, legacy, and acceptance. Occurring in one's late 60s and beyond, this crisis is profoundly backward-looking. It is a final reflection on the life lived, often motivated by the approaching reality of death. Issues: assessing whether one led a valuable and meaningful life and made a positive impact. Legacy: there's often a contemplation of past wrongdoings motivated by a desire to find a way to make up for them while one still can. Impediment to resolution: the individual is often unable to find the energy and youthfulness necessary to make meaningful changes. Resolution key: achieving acceptance of the reality of death and focusing on minimizing negative impacts through maintaining physical, economic, and emotional well-being. Ensuring earlier crises were resolved well makes later crises less severe. Chapter 2: The Crisis Across the Lifespan, a Developmental Journey. Existential crises are not random events or unique failures. They are fundamental, developmental turning points. They are not bound to a single time in life, but rather they emerge and transform, shifting their focus as we navigate life's inevitable transitions. Understanding which stage you're currently in helps to clarify the source of your meaning struggle, making the vast problem feel smaller and more manageable. This concept is rooted in the work of developmental theorists who recognize that the human psyche evolves through a series of psychosocial challenges. The intensity of the existential crisis at any given point simply reflects the unresolved developmental task of that stage. The crises generally fall into two broad, defining categories. Forward-looking: the crises of youth, characterized by the anxiety of infinite potential, and backward-looking: the crises of maturity, characterized by the confrontation with mortality. A. The forward-looking crises, anxiety of potential. These crises are characterized by an overwhelming sense of anxiety and confusion about the future, specifically, the path one should follow and the self one must become. The terror comes from the openness of possibility and the fear of making the wrong, irreversible choice. 1. The teenage crisis, identity and independence. This crucial period involves the transition from the safety of childhood dependency to the daunting freedom of adult independence. Its core is centered around the issue of developing one's unique individuality and independence from the familial unit. Issues: the task of differentiation. The teenager is actively engaged in separating their authentic self from the inherited identity provided by parents and community. This requires intensive, often painful, exploration to establish a personal moral code and find a genuine peer group that reflects their emerging values. Rebellious behavior is often a necessary, though sometimes clumsy, mechanism to assert that independence. Conformity to a peer group is frequently a temporary, transitional step, a borrowed identity used for safety while the true, internal identity is being forged. The philosophical core: who am I? This crisis tackles the question of self versus role. The teenager learns that they are not just defined by their role as a son or student, but must choose their essence. The philosophical concept of freedom hits hard here. They realize they are responsible for creating their own character. Resolution key: meaningful independence. The resolution lies in achieving a healthy, purposeful independence that is grounded in self-knowledge. Independence without purpose, however, is merely isolation, a state that quickly leads to the feeling of being directionless and can result in severe depression and apathy. The goal is to define a meaningful, self-chosen role that replaces the comfort of dependency. 2. The quarter-life crisis, sophomore and adult, occurring roughly between the ages of 18 and 30. This is the time of immense societal pressure to commit to a definitive life trajectory, a career, a primary relationship, and a location. The sophomore crisis, early 20s, the terror of infinite options. This is the first time that serious questions about career, long-term relationships, and the meaning of life become direct, practical and consequential issues tied to one's immediate future. The anxiety is overwhelming because it confronts one's future potential and the vast, frightening array of options. This crisis often specifically affects high achievers who fear they will not reach their highest potential, or who are paralyzed by the fear of choosing the wrong peak to climb. It is often referred to as the sophomore slump when affecting students, characterized by a sudden dip in motivation despite previous success. The adult crisis, mid to late 20s, the final commitment. This stage deepens the sophomore phase as abstract questions become concrete commitments. It incorporates complex identity issues like political outlook, spirituality, and sexuality. Resolving it means having a good, stable idea of who one is as a person and being comfortable with this identity. Reaching full adulthood, often associated with financial and residential independence. The philosophical core, the agony of choice. This crisis is an acute confrontation with existential freedom. The sheer number of options leads to a fear of making the wrong, irreversible decision, leading to paralysis, the inability to move forward. Committing too early without sufficient exploration, known as identity foreclosure, can resolve the immediate anxiety, but sets up a more severe, destructive crisis later on, when the self realizes it lives in a borrowed identity. Resolution key, commitment aligned with self. The answer is making practical, meaningful commitments that align with introspective self-knowledge, rather than just fulfilling societal expectations. The individual must move past analysis and commit to a vision of self that is authentic, even if it is not perfect. B. The backward-looking crises, regret and mortality. These crises are often triggered by the impression that one has passed their functional or reproductive peak. They force a profound process of assessment of past choices and a direct confrontation with finitude. The anxiety here is not about potential, but about time lost. 3. The midlife crisis, regret and reassessment, often setting in around age 40. This is the most widely discussed crisis. It's triggered by the palpable impression that personal growth is obstructed or that one's youthful aspirations are significantly distant from one's current achievements. Issues: the self versus the potential self. The pain stems from the intense questioning of past choices, career, partner, missed opportunities, and a backward-looking component that assesses previous decisions, leading to profound regrets and dissatisfaction. This is directly connected to the realization that one is past the peak period of physical and career ascent. The individual confronts the shadow self, the person they might have been if they had chosen differently. Triggers and context. Specific, undeniable events like job loss, extramarital affairs, separation, the death of a parent, or health problems bring mortality to the forefront. It affects women just as much as men, with additional factors for women often including the onset of menopause or the end of the reproductive period, which serves as a powerful reminder of biological finitude. The philosophical core, existential guilt and loss. This is a confrontation with existential guilt. Not guilt over something done wrong, but guilt over the failure to actualize one's full potential. The superficial attempts at resolution, the sports car, the sudden career change, are often desperate acts of denial aimed at reclaiming lost time. Resolution key, transition and reevaluation. The true resolution is not fighting the reality of age, but entering a deliberate period of transition and reevaluation. This means grieving the self that was never born, accepting the choices of the past, and focusing energy on adapting to a changed situation. The focus shifts from acquisition, career ascent, to contribution and meaning that remains in existing relationships or new, fulfilling activities. 3. The later life crisis, legacy and acceptance. Occurring in one's late 60s and beyond, this crisis is profoundly backward-looking and intensely focused on the conclusion of one's narrative. It is a final reflection on the life lived, often motivated by the approaching reality of death. Issues: integrity versus despair. Drawing from Erik Erikson's theory, the central task is assessing whether one led a valuable and meaningful life and made a positive impact. Legacy. The older individual must achieve a sense of integrity, the feeling that their life was a coherent, valuable story. There's often an intense contemplation of past wrongdoings motivated by a final, desperate desire to find a way to make up for them while one still can. Impediment to resolution: resource depletion. The deepest impediment to resolution here is practical. The individual is often unable to find the energy, physical health, or youthfulness necessary to make major, meaningful changes or undo past errors. The window for action is closing. The philosophical core: acceptance of finitude. This is the ultimate confrontation with death and isolation. The crisis is whether the meaning created over a lifetime can withstand the reality of one's extinction. Resolution key: acceptance of the reality of death. The resolution is achieved through acceptance of the reality of death and focusing on minimizing negative impacts through maintaining physical, economic, and emotional well-being. Individuals who successfully resolved earlier crises have an easier time, as their life story already feels coherent. The final wisdom is found in passing on knowledge and achieving a serene integration of the self. Chapter 3: Consequences and Clinical Manifestations. The confrontation with meaninglessness is absolutely not benign. It is a profound psychic wound that, if left untended, can contaminate virtually every area of one's life. Going through an unresolved existential crisis is associated with a wide variety of negative consequences, transforming inner philosophical turmoil into tangible, debilitating distress. On the personal level, the immediate effects are deeply negative, connected to chronic, low-grade stress, persistent anxiety, and the formation of bad relationships rooted in need rather than genuine connection. This internal erosion can quickly lead to profound, clinical depression if the crisis is not consciously resolved, as the person loses the will to meaning, the ultimate motivation to persevere. On the social and professional level, the consequences scale up. Unresolved crises are empirically linked to a higher divorce rate as partners fail to connect on authentic value systems. Furthermore, they contribute to an increased number of people being unable to make significant, positive contributions to society due to a crippling lack of drive and chronic apathy. The individual's creative potential is paralyzed by the belief that all effort is ultimately pointless. However, and this is the philosophical pivot, if this crisis is resolved properly, it can have immensely powerful positive effects. It functions as a forced metamorphosis, pushing the individual to shed inauthentic values, find true sources of meaning, develop as a person far beyond their stagnant former self, and fundamentally improve their way of life based on self-chosen purpose. The suffering becomes the catalyst for growth. The landscape of maladaptive coping, a major area of concern in existential psychotherapy, is recognizing when the lack of meaning expresses itself in maladaptive or inauthentic ways. The individual, deep down, feels purposeless but attempts to mask this terrifying feeling through frantic activity or destructive denial. This is the difference between facing the void and desperately filling it with substitutes. Inauthentic coping and false centering. This set of behaviors represents the individual's attempt to deny their freedom and responsibility by latching onto external structures that promise meaning or distraction. This is known as false centering. Overt zealotry and compulsive activity. In a desperate attempt to wrest themselves free from the paralysis of meaninglessness, some become overly adventurous, risk-taking, or fanatically zealous. They indiscriminately dedicate themselves to any cause, political, spiritual, or even commercial, without concern for its content or their personal safety. This frantic immersion is understood as a primary defense mechanism against the dread of the void. They are trying to force a meaning onto themselves by sheer intensity of action. Workaholism and obsessive pursuit. This is one of the most common and socially accepted forms of denial. It expresses itself as compulsive activities such as workaholism or the obsessive pursuit of prestige, status, or material acquisitions. This is called false centering because the activity is pursued more as a distraction from the self than because it is inherently fulfilling. It provides temporary alleviation by helping the individual drain their energy and thus distract them from the threat of meaninglessness. The ego is satisfied by the external validation of success, even if the soul remains empty. Addiction and self-medication. This involves turning to drugs, alcohol, compulsive gambling, or ritualistic sexual behavior to lessen the immediate, crushing impact of the negative internal experiences. These actions provide short-term pleasure, the will-to-pleasure substitute, and temporary psychological numbing, but are usually profoundly maladaptive on the long-term level. They create a temporary shield but fail to resolve the core conflict and often severely exacerbate the crisis by creating further guilt, shame, and isolation. The person struggles desperately to distinguish the need for pleasure and power from the fundamental need for meaning. Overt nihilism and hostility. Another cognitive response is an explicit declaration of nihilism, characterized by a pervasive tendency to discredit the activities purported by others to have meaning. The person cannot bear to see meaning in others because it highlights their own emptiness. They may, for example, dismiss altruism as a disingenuous form of selfishness or view all political leaders as corrupt. This is a corrosive defense mechanism that attempts to neutralize the world's meaning so the individual's own lack of it is less painful. Aimlessness and apathy. The shutdown in some more extreme forms of crisis. The individual's behavior shows severe aimlessness and profound apathy, often accompanied by clinical depression. Being unable to find good reasons for making an effort, such a person remains inactive for extended periods of time or engages in behavior indiscriminately without much concern for what they are doing. This is the state where the will to meaning has been completely thwarted, resulting in emotional and behavioral paralysis. Clinical associations and empirical evidence. Various empirical studies have consistently shown that a lack of sense of meaning in life is strongly associated with psychopathology. The concept of an existential vacuum is not merely a philosophical idea. It is a measurable clinical risk factor. Studies link low scores on meaning in life scales with higher rates of anxiety disorders, substance abuse, and even trauma-related symptoms. Conversely, having a positive sense of meaning is consistently associated with greater resilience, higher levels of well-being, and a greater capacity to cope with traumatic events. These protective factors are tied to having deeply held beliefs, a clear life goal, and having dedicated oneself to a cause larger than the self. The stress associated with the inner conflict is not only psychological. The chronic anxiety can lead to serious health problems, including high blood pressure, chronic inflammation, and long-term organ damage due to the sustained activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Chapter 4. Measurement. Diagnosing the void. To help clinical professionals accurately assess the degree of crisis and track the progress of therapy, tools have been developed to measure this seemingly abstract concept. This is typically done through questionnaires focusing on the meaning of life, allowing the clinician to quantify the existential vacuum. The Purpose in Life Test, PAL. The most widely used instrument is the Purpose in Life Test, PIL. This test consists of 20 items rated on a 7-point scale, where one end represents the extreme of meaninglessness and the other the extreme of purpose. Example items. The test measures statements such as, "In life I have 1. No goals or aims at all," to 7. Very clear goals and aims. With regard to death, I am 1. Unprepared and frightened. 2. 7. Prepared and unafraid. If I should die today, I would feel that my life has been 1. Completely worthless. 2. 7. Very worthwhile. Such measurements help to accurately diagnose the severity of the crisis and distinguish between a simple lack of pleasure and a genuine existential struggle. They provide objective data points for a phenomenon that often feels purely subjective, guiding the individual and the therapist toward an effective path for creating self-authored meaning. Chapter 5. The 3 pathways to resolution and coping. Since existential crises can have such a crippling, paralyzing effect, finding a way to resolve the core conflict is crucial for psychological health and continued development. The difficulty lies in the fact that there is no single, prescribed solution. The right approach often depends on the type of crisis, forward-looking versus backward-looking, and the individual's inherent intellectual disposition, whether they are inclined toward intuitive, faith-based processing or rigorous, rational analysis. The resolutions available can be divided into 3 complementary domains: philosophical commitment, pragmatic coping mechanisms, and clinical tools for cognitive restructuring. A. Finding meaning. Faith, reason, or acceptance. The philosophical commitment. These 3 paths directly address the cognitive anchor of the crisis, the problem of meaninglessness. They represent 3 fundamental ways an individual can choose to relate to the indifferent cosmos. 1. The leap of faith. The path of intuitive commitment. This approach, famously championed by Soren Kierkegaard, implies committing oneself entirely to a new system of meaning, whether spiritual, relational, or ideological, without previous in-depth rational understanding or empirical proof. The commitment is driven by a strong, internal desire that life is meaningful and a refusal to live in perpetual doubt. Psychological speed. For those oriented toward intuitive processing and emotional fulfillment, this can be the fastest path out of the paralysis of the crisis. It bypasses the need for endless, crippling analysis. Robustness. The meaning acquired this way is often paradoxically robust because it is not based on empirical evidence. It is, therefore, less vulnerable to being disproven by evidence against it, such as scientific skepticism or personal tragedy. It provides an absolute anchor that reason cannot easily dislodge. The ethical dimension. This leap often involves an ethical commitment, moving beyond the aesthetic, pleasure-seeking stage and the purely ethical, rule-following stage into the religious stage, where one submits to an ultimate, transcendent value. 2. The reasoned approach. The path of rational construction. This is the path of the more rationally inclined person, the individual who cannot silence their critical mind with a leap of faith. It involves a careful, honest evaluation of potential sources of meaning based on solid justification through empirical evidence and profound self-reflection. The process of construction. This approach is demanding. It requires patiently rebuilding one's value system piece by piece, determining what is actually meaningful based on internal evidence, skills, and observed positive impact. This process includes intellectual struggle and existential questioning, foundation and resilience. If successful, this approach provides a concrete and realistic understanding of how one's life is meaningful. While it can take a considerable amount of time, the self-knowledge and foundations arrived at this way provide a solid basis to withstand future crises. It offers more room for personal growth due to the immense cognitive reflection involved in defining one's idiosyncratic, self-specific meaning. 3. Nihilism and acceptance. The path of radical truthfulness. This approach is taken if the exhaustive search for meaning, both rational and intuitive, fails. It consists in accepting the meaninglessness of life and learning how to deal with it without the illusion of purpose. This position is usually referred to as nihilism, or often, more gently, as absurdism, as with Camus. The virtue of honesty. This stance exemplifies the virtue of truthfulness by acknowledging an inconvenient cosmic reality instead of escaping into the convenient illusion of meaningfulness. It is the refusal to lie to oneself. The heightened freedom. While this stance offers very little practical guidance in terms of what to do, it can lead to a heightened sense of freedom. By being unbound from any predetermined external purpose, the individual is free to act purely on self-willed grounds. This freedom is terrifying but also absolute. It is the ultimate assertion of self-authorship. The resolution here is finding dignity in rebellion against the absurd. B. Zaf's four mechanisms for coping with the absurd, the pragmatic defenses. The Norwegian philosopher and deep ecology advocate Peter Wessel Zaf offered a more practical, almost psychological view of coping. He argued that the meaninglessness of life is so terrifying that the only way for the deeply reflective human to survive without collapsing into depression is to employ these four defense mechanisms to manage the raw pain of the absurd. 1. Isolation. This involves a conscious, strategic dismissal of destructive, nihilistic thoughts and feelings from consciousness. The individual creates a cognitive no-fly zone over certain difficult truths, preserving their ability to function. For example, a medical student might adopt a purely detached and technical stance to better deal with the tragic or gruesome aspects of their vocation, isolating the emotional reality from the practical task. 2. Anchoring. This mechanism involves a dedication to certain values and practical commitments that give the individual a stable sense of assurance and predictability. This often happens collectively, through devotion to a common religion, social institution, or rigid moral code. These anchors serve as solid, man-made structures in the flux of existence. 3. Distraction. This is a more temporary and superficial form of withdrawing one's attention from the existential issues. It involves filling time and focus with immediate, absorbing tasks to prevent the mind from dwelling on the meaninglessness of certain situations. This is used to avoid engaging in contemplation that doesn't significantly contribute to the construction of the self, allowing for necessary periods of respite from the inner struggle. 4. Sublimation, the rarest, most powerful, and arguably the most productive mechanism. Its essential characteristic is that it transforms the pain of living and the terror of the void into a work of art or another profound creative expression. The suffering itself is repurposed and channeled into something of objective value. This channel, the Sleeper Philosopher, in its small way, is an example of sublimation, taking existential inquiry and transforming it into a creative, calming experience for others. C. Clinical tools for interchange, the therapeutic intervention, beyond grand philosophical commitments. Practical, evidence-based methods from clinical psychology are essential for healing the immediate psychological distress and enabling the individual to even begin the search for meaning. 1. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and core belief CBT is often adapted to address the cognitive distortions that trap the individual in crisis. CBT focuses on the idea that psychological problems arise due to inaccurate, deep-seated core beliefs about oneself, such as the belief that one is worthless, unlovable, or fundamentally helpless. Intervention. Therapy involves raising awareness of these toxic thought patterns, the internal narration that feeds the despair, and training the person to change them through practical methods. This includes focusing on the immediate present, mindfulness techniques to reduce free-floating anxiety, rigorous goal setting to rebuild the sense of efficacy, and behavioral experiments, testing if the core belief is actually true in reality. 2. Social perspective taking. Gaining distance. This involves the deliberate ability to assess one's situation, character, and choices from the point of view of a different individual, often a respected mentor, a loved one, or the generalized other. Mechanism. This technique enables you to step outside your own immediate, anxious, and highly subjective perspective. This cognitive distance helps to reduce self-absorption and allows for a more integral and balanced view of yourself, making the crisis seem less unique and less insurmountable. It combats the core existential anxiety of isolation by reintroducing a social frame of reference. 3. External resolutions, aligning self and world sometimes. The crisis is fueled less by cosmic dread and more by a deep, grinding misalignment between one's identity and one's environment. The role of career. Crises related to one's professional path are often approached by finding the right type of career, one that matches both internal interests and demonstrable skills. The goal is to move from a job that is purely instrumental, a paycheck, to one that offers a source of meaning, contribution, challenge, creativity, thus resolving the cognitive dissonance that makes the individual feel unfulfilled or overwhelmed. These external changes are often the practical manifestations of a successful internal shift in values. Chapter 6. The crisis in cultural and historical context. The existential crisis, while rooted in universal human fears of death and isolation, is profoundly shaped by the age in which we live. It is often seen as a phenomenon specifically associated with modern society, a chronic condition born from the intellectual and social revolutions of the past 2 centuries. A. The collapse of traditional anchors. The silence of the cosmos historically. Meaning was an inherited certainty. It was provided by immutable structures, the church, the local community, the hereditary trade, and the strict social hierarchy. Modernity shattered these pillars, leaving the individual exposed to the indifferent vastness of the cosmos. The loss of faith. This transition is symbolized by the loss of religious certainty. Thomas Carlyle, in his work, lamented the move toward a center of indifference, describing the profound anxiety and moral confusion that followed the dissolution of the unquestioned belief in a benevolent God and a preordained universal plan. Nietzsche and the death of God. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche delivered the most radical proclamation, the death of God. He recognized this not just as a theological event, but as a devastating cultural fact. For Nietzsche, this meant the entire Western moral and metaphysical framework, the foundation upon which all values were built, had collapsed. This created a widespread crisis for the philosophically aware, leaving them to grapple with the terrifying task of becoming their own moral compass. Anomie and alienation. Sociologist Emil Durkheim identified a related social condition called anomie, a state of normlessness or a partial lack of collective norms in society. When society fails to provide clear moral instruction, the individual is left adrift, feeling unmoored and alienated. B. The agony of choice. The tyranny of freedom. Another major factor unique to modern society is the daunting number of decisions and alternatives individuals are faced with, often without any clear, accepted guidelines. We are no longer told who to marry, what job to take, or where to live. The problem of radical freedom, the increased freedom to choose one's life path, in stark contrast to historical necessity, is the very cause of modern anxiety. If all options are open, then every choice made is simultaneously a choice not made, generating the existential guilt of unused potential. The pressure is immense to choose the best life from an infinite array of possibilities. The cost of opportunity, the high difficulty of finding the best alternative, and the gravity of the decision is often referred to as the agony of choice. This is the practical, daily version of the existential anxiety of freedom. The modern individual is perpetually exhausted, not from hard work, but from the constant, low-level cognitive labor of assessment and commitment. C. Modernism, postmodernism, and the changing face of angst. The existential crisis became the intellectual signature of the 20th century, but its manifestation has continued to evolve. Modernism, c. 1890, 1945, the age of existential dread. The initial philosophical answers to the loss of anchors were dramatic and intense. Some, like Martin Buber, sought a revivified religion centered on the personal, relational encounter with the divine. Others, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, championed an individualistic existentialism based on facing directly the absurd contingency of human fate. Their goal was to find nobility and authenticity in deliberate, self-willed action despite the meaninglessness of the world. The formalization of therapy, this intense philosophical focus formalized the clinical approach to the crisis. Thinkers like Irvin Yalom and Rollo May made fundamental contributions to existential psychotherapy, establishing it as a distinct therapeutic modality focused on the four givens of existence: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. Postmodernism, late 20th century, the flattened effect. In contemporary times, theorists like Frederick Jameson suggest that the postmodern condition, with its saturation by visual consumer culture and mass media, has replaced the active, churning modernist angst with a new pathology of flattened effect. This is a sense of emotional numbness and detachment rather than active, philosophical dread. The crisis isn't always about the terror of the void, but about the boredom of the superficial, a sense that nothing is deep enough to truly warrant intense feeling or commitment. The meaning has been replaced by spectacle. Ultimately, many existential crises in contemporary society are not resolved through philosophical clarity or therapeutic commitment. They simply pass into the background, often because of a lack of clear awareness of their nature and possible treatments. But even in this dormant state, like a slow-burning infection, they remain capable of increasing the likelihood and difficulty of suffering a far more severe crisis later in life. Chapter 7. Final Reflection and Guided Relaxation. The sound of the rain becomes slightly more prominent, rising gently, then slowly fades back to a gentle background whisper and the distant, soft crackle of the fire. We have traveled a long road tonight, tracing the anxiety from the individual heart all the way to the vast, indifferent cosmos. Take a moment now to simply breathe. Inhale deeply, allowing your chest to expand. Exhale slowly, releasing the tension in your jaw and your shoulders. The truth we arrive at is this: existential crises are not a flaw in your character, nor are they a sign of madness. They are simply the sound of a life demanding meaning, a testament to your highest human potential. The crisis is not a condemnation. It is, in the most profound sense, an invitation to exercise your most rare and difficult human capacity, the capacity to create your own value. Reframing the goal tonight is not to eliminate anxiety entirely. That would be impossible and perhaps undesirable, as a little anxiety keeps us authentic. The goal is to reframe it. The moment you ask, "What is the meaning of all this?" you have demonstrated the will to meaning. That curiosity, that restless searching, that persistent philosophical ache is proof of your life's potential for purpose. As you drift now, let go of the intellectual need for a cosmic, external answer. You don't need a guarantee from the universe. You only need a genuine, moment-by-moment commitment from yourself. We ground ourselves in the secular personal meaning, the small, powerful acts of creation and connection you can commit to tomorrow, acts that fill the void you have so bravely identified. The anchors of meaning focus now on the silent affirmation of these three anchors we discussed. 1. A small act of altruism for someone you love, grounding you in connection. Choose to see someone else's need before your own and act. 2. A moment of creativity in your work or your hobby, proving your capacity to generate value. Allow your hands, your mind, your skills to bring something new into being. 3. The courage to hold a dignified, virtuous attitude toward any challenge you face, demonstrating your final, inner freedom. These small, self-created sources are sufficient. They are not illusions. They are the tangible proof of your ability to choose value in a world that offers none prepackaged. They are your anchors in the storm. There is deep peace to be found in acknowledging the vastness of the universe and choosing, nonetheless, to live a life meaningfully created by you, authored by you, and judged by your own best conscience. Let the weight of the world lift from your shoulders. You are not without meaning. You are a meaning creator. Good night, Sleeper Philosopher. Sleep well, and may your dreams be both calm and deeply purposeful.